I'd like to focus this evening on the figure from our first reading, the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk was a prophet in Israel at a fascinating time in their history. He was faithful to the laws of Moses and tried to live a virtuous life, but he became dismayed by the evil that he saw around him. And he saw two principal evils that scared him. First, he saw the evil of his fellow Israelites. The people of God had descended into violence and sin. Their kingdom was filled with rampant corruption. The kings and leaders had forgotten God, and the people were consumed with violence. And that is why we read that Habakkuk said to God, "I cry out to you violence, but you do not intervene." Habakkuk is desperately frustrated with the faithlessness of the chosen people, especially of their leaders. But they were not his only concern. He was also frightened by a power arising in the east. A new kingdom was on the rise from the city of Babylon, and by all accounts, they seemed to be unstoppable and insatiable. They destroyed the ancient power of Assyria and thrived on violence, sin, and corruption. To the tiny kingdom of Judah, this was indeed a terrifying threat. And so Habakkuk addresses God, and he asks why God has allowed his people to fall into sin. And then he asks what exactly God plans on doing about those evil Babylonians. "Why do you let me see ruin? Why must I look at misery?" he says. And God gives a most unexpected answer, most of which we miss in the first reading of today's Mass. But God goes on to say, "Look over the nations and see, be utterly amazed. For a work is being done in your days that you would not believe were it told. For now I am raising up the Babylonians, that bitter and impulsive people, who march the breadth of the land to take dwellings not their own. They are terrifying and dreadful. Their right and their exalted position are of their own making. All of them come for violence. Their combined onslaught a storm wind that gathers up captives like sand. They scoff at kings, ridicule princes. They laugh at any fortress, heap up an earthen ramp and conquer it. Then they sweep through like the wind and vanish. They make their own strength their God." And God was right. Habakkuk needed to see it to believe it. So much of this book of Habakkuk is him wrestling with this notion of an all good and loving God allowing this to happen, actually raising up the Babylonians to come and attack Israel. And what we can learn from looking back at this troubled history is that Israel, in a sense, brought this on themselves. And let me explain what I mean by that. God, of course, gave the Israelites free will out of his great love. He also gave the Israelites a specific and a special job as the chosen people. They were to be a light to the nations. They were to live in God's law and to be an example of how following God's law is the only way to human flourishing. And from this example, their neighbors were supposed to want to be like Israel, and therefore they would learn about God and how to live good and holy lives themselves. However, as the beginning of Habakkuk makes clear, the Israelites had once again failed in this mission. They were themselves consumed with violence and sin. I think it's completely reasonable to assume that God's first choice for dealing with a violent Babylon was the good and holy witness of Israel, a witness that Israel was unwilling to give. The relationship that God had in mind for Israel has been compared to that of brothers. Israel, as the older brother, was tasked with being a good example for the younger brother. But if the older brother gives in to violence, is it a surprise when the younger brother follows in his footsteps? Now, we need to be clear. This is not to say that everyone in Israel was a bad example. Habakkuk himself is proof that's not the case. And it's also not to say that the Israelites were responsible for every bit of evil that befell them. And it's not to say that Babylon was not responsible for their own actions. They followed their own free will into sin. So when Habakkuk asks what God's plan is for his people, now that they have failed at their task, God tells him that he will have to see it to believe it. And that's because that new plan involves getting conquered by the Babylonians. But this was not a defeat. It's not the end of the story. The kingdom of Judah was defeated, yes, but the people clung to their identity as the chosen people of God, even as they went off into exile. And a few generations later, Queen Esther, through her holiness and faith in God's plan, would convince the new king to send the Israelites back to their ancestral land and to rebuild their temple. So what can we take away from this today? I think many people in our church today can relate to Habakkuk. We can feel that so many in positions of authority have failed so grievously. And maybe we feel that those who are opposed to the message of Christ are gaining power in the world. Or Habakkuk's questioning of how God could allow evil to happen might resonate in some aspects of our own lives, in our families or in our work. And the lesson that we can take from Habakkuk is twofold. First, the most effective way to fight evil in the world is by living and loving in the example of Christ. The most effective way to fight evil in the world is by living and loving in the example of Christ, so that we can then be an example to all those around us. And second, whatever evil seems to be befalling us, our communities, our nation, our church, we must always have faith that God still has a plan, and that plan can lead all of us to Him. Paul defines faith as the realization of what is hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. When we are faced with the evil of the world and are unable to see God's plan with our natural eyes, we should make the same request as the disciples in today's gospel. Lord, increase our faith.